Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naja Kassir. I work at CDPC as doing community engagement and public education. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you're from, and I'm curious to know also if it's your first time at a CDPC event. Please let us know that. I'm going to be speaking in French for a second for our French attendees. So if you don't understand, that's normal. Bonjour tout le monde. Si vous parlez seulement français, on a l'interprétation simultanée offerte. Vous pouvez regarder dans le bas de votre écran. Il y a l'option interprétation. Vous avez juste à cliquer dessus. Puis vous allez pouvoir avoir accès à l'interprétation en français. So for everyone, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to have conversations with each other, share your thoughts. If you have questions specifically, we will be having a Q&A for the last 15 minutes. So you can just add your question in the Q&A section. And if you don't really know what questions to ask, but you still want to contribute, feel free to check it out as the panel goes, because there is an option to upvote the questions that you are the most interested in seeing the panelists answer. So we might not be able to ask each question in chronological order as we receive them, but we will ask them as the questions that have been the most upvoted. So to open the webinar, I would like to invite my colleagues Bita Sinajani and Shane Calder to speak about the project itself. And after that, I'll introduce the panelists and we'll start the discussion. So Shane or Bita, please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Oh, it's a lot of people here, and I will admit my palms are a little sweaty. It's a little nervous, but I'm really glad to be doing this all with you today, and I'm really excited to hear from our panelists. So while we were able to meet with the Nanaimo and Nelson community specifically in person, the GTT project was by and large a Zoom-based experience. Certainly for us, we weren't traveling to all the communities. Some communities were able to gather together. We would Zoom into them, or it'd be like this sort of Zoom experience. This being true, First Nations peoples, communities, and organizations were present in each and every dialogue. In addition to the 7 core recommendation areas, it was made crystal clear to us that the war on drugs is a deeply colonial project with long-lasting and ongoing impacts on Indigenous people and communities. Rather than repeating the statistics we all know too well concerning Indigenous peoples and the impacts of the toxic drug crisis, rather, I would like to offer my deepest respect and gratitude to the leadership and innovation of innumerable First Nations communities and organizations saving lives and permanently transforming harm reduction and drug policy for the benefit of us all. It is with humility and admiration that we carry these lessons forward in our work forward here today. And now I'll pass it off to Bita, and I think we're going to do a little back and forth as we describe some of the outcomes of the project before we pass it back to Naja. Bita.
Thanks, Jane. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here in this space with you all. We're here to launch the thing. It took a long time. Here we are. Really excited for you all to see the report. It's very long, just a heads up. But use what you can. We hope it'll be useful in your local advocacy. We'd love to hear how that goes. So I'll share a little bit about the project. It was about 3 years of meeting with communities across the country from coast to coast. A lot of that was during the pandemic, so we did much of them virtually, with the exception of 2 in-person dialogues that we were lucky enough to do. So I'm going to name the cities and the provinces and territories where we hosted a dialogue with different scopes. So thank you to all of you and our community partners in all of these communities, which really was the success of the project, I think. So big thanks to you. You didn't have to do this work, but you did. So thank you, Nelson, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Gatineau, Barrie, Hamilton, as far as our city-based dialogues. And then for the provinces and territories, we were able to visit New Brunswick, Montreal is a city. I skipped that in the first list. New Brunswick, Yukon, Manitoba. Also adding Nanaimo to our city-based dialogues. Thank you. We were able to do 2 special kinds of dialogues that weren't based on a geographic region. So we hosted one dialogue with the BC Health Coalition that was for their members. It was a bit of an experiment, and that has led to a really positive and collaborative working relationship. We also hosted a dialogue for members of the GTA mainly, who are part of the ACB community, that is African, Caribbean, and Black community, and allies. So that was a really focused dialogue to uncover and discuss how drug policy is landing in ACB communities. Huge thank you to everyone for your collaboration. This process of going through the dialogues has informed our work and our ability to be effective when policy changes happen. It's been great to be able to call on all of you at the times that we need to. So a big thank you. And I just want to send a special thank you to those with lived experience who shared so openly at the dialogues. We know that when we come into these spaces of dialogues, it's very different when you're talking about your personal life and your experiences of harm. So I just want to send an incredible, we're very grateful for that. Thank you. I'll quickly touch on the report itself. I'll explain the 5 overall themes, and then Shane will discuss the 7 action items that we took from the data and the discussion. So out of our 5 themes, I'll start with the first one. And I know a lot of this isn't going to be news to all of you who are gathered here today, but we'll start with the reality of the toxic market, the unregulated drug supply. It's resulting in deaths, it's resulting in injuries, the bodily reality of the unregulated drug supply. And also it's resulting in vicarious cycles of trauma, grief, anticipatory grief, etc. So that's the first key point. The second is people who use drugs face stigma and discrimination, which is impacting access to healthcare and housing. So it's not only the toxic nature of the supply itself, it's how power essentially is operating through these drug policies to exclude people and oppress people and deny their most fundamental human rights, housing, healthcare, etc. Third point, people who use drugs, particularly those who are unhoused, face experiences of harm, negative interactions with police and other local law enforcement and private security. So through our federal drug policy, then police and security become empowered to then impose upon the liberties of people who use drugs, or even people who are suspected to be using drugs. Another way in which power operates, leading to whether it's formally through arrests, incarceration, charges, child welfare interventions, so-called, or, being banned from a particular location, being excluded from a social community, etc. Moving on to the last 2 points, we were able to visit some rural and remote communities, which have a completely different context compared to large urban centers. And so in our report, we're calling for improved access to healthcare, treatment, and harm reduction services within rural and remote communities so people can stay in their home communities and be supported. And lastly, noting that African, Caribbean, and Black communities experience the compounding effects of racial profiling, police surveillance, and discrimination and criminalization, and drug policy is used as a lever to do so. I think it is so important, and I know this opinion is shared with so many of us here. This is an intersectional issue. It's not about the drugs. It's about oppression. It's about power. It's about exclusion. So yeah, thank you for listening to all that. I'll pass it over to Shane to go over the 7 actions.
Thank you. When you get a chance to, read this report cover to cover, I know when you all curl up tonight, you're just gonna open it up, and there's 87 individual recommendations, and so certainly our obligation, our commitment to the communities who came forward, who used their voices, who told us how they feel, is that we want to use those recommendations. And so over time, and certainly this panel is meant to help us orientate how we do that, is we are going to use these recommendations at every opportunity we have to put them in front of government, to push them in front of government. And certainly, as we talk to other communities who may, drug policy may not be their central piece, they may not know a lot about it. So what you have put into this report is also a relationship building exercise with other communities who are like, okay, drug policy, tell me more. Where do I fit? And certainly, and we'll go through this now. So we have a right to know. How data is collected does not include everyone. And this was loud and clear in the ACB dialogue, is the sort of stance that we're getting about who is impacted, how they're impacted, what communities are being really underserviced and maybe over-policed. We need that data. The data does drive a policy. Power drives policy, but our data allows us to go to the public. It allows us to create assets. It allows us to go to people who want change, who know things can be better. We demand that those governments that are collecting the data, they collaborate with the communities most impacted to ensure that the data is working for them. We need to make it grow. We need to expand harm reduction services, which is precisely the opposite of what the Ford government in Ontario has just done. When that demand was made, we have seen actually a shrinking of harm reduction services across Canada. And we're going to get into that. But our central demand to see universal access to harm reduction services, regardless of region, regardless of community, equal access for all, is a demand I believe that we all share. Decriminalization. I mean, criminalizing people has never worked. It is a knee-jerk, conservative, unthought out approach to a complicated problem, only complicated for those who have power. We know what has to be done, but we will always take a stand against criminalization and for the ever-growing expansion of decriminalization. We must remove those laws from our books. We have an obligation and a demand to preserve life. Safe supply options, prescribed and non-prescribed, have been in countless reports beyond these. Other jurisdictions have made these arguments. Health officials, coroners, doctors have put these demands in front of governments that don't want to hear it. They'd rather take a more criminalized approach. They'd rather invest into for-profit treatment. We will continue to demand any and all diversion from the toxic drug market that our governments clearly are terribly resistant to legally regulating. And what was made loud and clear in every single dialogue, nothing about us without us, meaningfully consult people who use drugs and implement collaborative processes when developing drug policy, harm reduction, and healthcare services. Our collective movement, how we are working to achieve power. And some of that is education, but some of that is actual physical power, is our reach and our breadth, is to ensure that voices are not just heard, they are centered, and they are the reason to be. They are the actual how decisions get made come from the people that it is all about, not policymakers in Ottawa, right? And what was also made clear to us is the final point over and over. Oh, it's the second to last final point. Oh, I tricked you. Is housing for all. The connection between drug policy and housing could not be more closely linked. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about affordable housing. We talk about adequate housing. I think as a movement, we're going to have to figure out how we're describing it, because as long as housing is controlled by providers that have an anti-harm reduction, anti-drug user approach, it can be affordable all you want. It's not going to serve our needs. So to what extent are the people in control of that housing? So we need housing, but it's not just any old housing. It must be appropriate to and responsive to the needs of the people who are living there. It's their housing, it's their homes. They should control it. And lastly, there is a vast problem in this country about prohibitionist policies in shelters and housing. So you make the shelters, you make that the housing, and then you kick people out. The encampments that we have in Canada are in no small part fueled by the anti-harm reduction policies of housing providers and shelters. That was made clear to us coast to coast, that if we are going to advance our cause, we must ensure that anyone who is taking public funds must have pro-harm reduction, pro-drug user policies, and include those voices in the very bones of its construction from the beginning. Bita, do you have anything more that you'd like to add?
That was
and then
great.
we'll pass it off. Is it okay? Good. Okay, Naja, we're going to pass it off to you.
Thanks so much, Bita and Shane, for going over those key points in the report. Before I introduce our panelists today, I just want to invite people to check out the report. I know it can be intimidating to look at a report that is so many pages long, but don't put yourself the pressure to just sit down and read it all at once. Maybe identify the part of the report that you're more interested in, or that you feel is more relevant to your work. And so for today's conversation, we're not going to go so much into the details of each point in the report. We want to kind of go beyond the report. What does it mean to participate in a dialogue, leading to a report? And what is work? What is the impact of these kinds of dialogue in our communities after a report is launched or after the dialogues have happened? So we have three panelists today. We have Aretha McCarthy, Dylan Griffith, and Steve Caldwell. I will quickly read their bios. So Aretha, with over 15 years of immersive experience in combating mental health, gun, and gang violence, brings a profound understanding of trauma-informed, culturally responsive strategies to prevent and intervene in community violence. Her expertise lies in addressing the root causes of violence through a comprehensive focus on the people, places, and behaviors that drive it. As a dedicated community professional, she has the proven track records of collaborating with diverse stakeholders to develop and implement effective policies that enhance community safety to improve the social service sector. Dylan is the co-founder of Kootenay Independent Safe Supply Society, a small grassroots group focused on advocacy and direct action aimed at advancing the development of innovative, community-based alternative to the unregulated drug supply. With a background in arts and culture, a strong analysis of injustice, a deep well of compassion, and a personal investment in building more inclusive communities, his contribution to rural harm reduction offers much needed hope in this prolonged crisis. And finally, we have Steve Caldwell. Steve is a mental health support worker at Riverstone Recovery Center, where he uses an eclectic therapeutic toolkit blending social justice principle, acceptance commitment therapy, and cognitive behavior therapy. Steve's work focuses on peer engagement, destigmatizing healthcare, and addressing access barriers for clients. With a commitment to holistic care, he helps individuals navigate mental health challenges while promoting empowerment and inclusivity in therapeutic settings. Steve is also the regional peer lead of SUNAR, the Substance User Network of Atlantic Region, a father, a person who uses drug, and someone who wants to help. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Aretha first, then Dylan, and then Steve our first question, which is reflecting on what was identified in the report. So the themes and the 7 recommendation. Is there one theme that feels specifically connected to your current work or to the current needs of your community? Aretha.
So to answer that question, when I think about the 7 themes that we reflect on and, reminiscing about the last 3 years working, with Beta and Shane on this, it's nothing about us without us. And I say that too, because even in my new role as the CEO of Revive, the Sexual Assault Rate Crisis Center of Peel, that was actually, I came into that being the slogan of the organization and what that meant, right? And when we think about the work that we do, whether it is harm reduction, it's policy making, we all have to think about that collaborative measure. And I think that's what we're missing when we talk about the work that we do in the community. So that's something that within my work in my community, I walk and I talk about it because we work so much in silos. We don't work together. And if we're not working together, nothing is going to get done. Right. And I think that's the key point of, getting to where we need to is the collaboration piece, bringing community leaders together, advocates, service users, policymakers, and those who have lived experience. That's one thing that we're missing in a lot of our work is those who have lived it, those who have experienced it. They have the most knowledge than us, even as community workers doing the work and fighting for them, right? Sitting down with each individual, and that's what I do with my work as a CEO at the front line, dealing with folks who have experienced sexual assault, human trafficking, rape, and then dealing with folks that, as a founder of Develop Me Youth, when it comes to kids and, youth and family members who have experienced this and time again, those who have used drugs or picking up a gun or is being sexually assaulted and abused even by a young age. If we're not coming together, there's nothing about us. There's just no alliance when it comes to the services that we're providing to ensure the solutions are not being imposed, right, from top down when we're rooted in our lived experience, those needs, the aspiration. And that I can even speak of when it comes to the Black community, right? We are working in silos when it comes to Black community. We don't know about the culture, what that looks like. And those are the things that we now have to speak about and embed in our policies, and try to acknowledge. In my field right now, I come in and we had to implement a Black and Indigenous focus because those experiences, we're talking about therapeutical, trauma-informed therapists. When it comes to trauma-informed cultural needs, that's not even included. Imagine me going into a therapist room, seeing somebody that doesn't look like me. There's no understanding what my needs are. There's no understanding what that culture looks like, my background, where I was rooted from, right? And where I'm coming from. So I think to best fit that, all in all, that nothing about us without us, it just summarized the 7 recommendation and all when it has to do with housing, when it has to do with, making sure that there's housing for all, preserving life in itself, right? Those insecurities, when we're talking about food insecurities, that's with all of us. When you're talking about growth in itself and ensuring that we're all growing as a team, we're all growing as a unit, we're all growing as a community. We cannot do none of these things if we're not coming together like we are right now in this room, speaking up about these things, speaking up about the work that we've done and the push that needs to be done to ensure the meaningful work that needs to continue, right? So again, nothing about us without us. It's just something for me that stood out. And it just so happened that doing the work that I do, that was our slogan. And I believe in that to the fullest, because without us coming together and collaborating and doing this work, there's no progress, right? We stay still, we stand still, and there's no movement forward. And we always talk about doing things, but there's never actions behind what we talk about. And that's what we need to start doing when we talk about moving forward together in hindsight with situations like this, when it comes to community work, when it comes to the work that we do.
I'm up next. Hi, everyone. So I kind of bounced between a few of them, and the two that really stood out for me were preserving life and make it grow. And I think, I mean, preserving life is sort of what I got into this work for. I think it's the central piece of what I think harm reduction is about, and certainly what Safe Supply is about, and what the organization I started was focused on. And in looking at us, I mean, we're in a rural. I'm from Nelson, BC, and in the rural context, the make it grow piece is so important because we have so little here, and it's we have 2 Safe Supply prescribers here in Nelson, and then there's in the radius around us of a few hundred kilometers, a handful, maybe 3 that I can think of, in Grand Forks, one in Trail, one in Castlegar. So there's so few providers. There's very few overdose prevention sites. We have one here in Nelson. There's going to be one in Trail opening up at the shelter there when that opens in a few months. But that'll be for tenants only. And so we're so it's so few and far between the services that we have, and we're so stretched thin. The living in these small communities, we're so tight knit. And we really know the community. They're our neighbors, they're our friends. And so when we lose people, it is felt so deeply in the community, and it impacts people working in the front lines. So it's just an unsustainable burden. And I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough, is the impact that this drug crisis is having on both those, the drug. I mean, we're intermixed. It's the drug users are frontline workers in a lot of cases. So it's having a tremendous impact, and it's unconscionable that we're in the 9th year of this crisis. So yeah, absolutely, we need to make the services grow, and it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate that we're seem to be heading in the opposite direction right now. And I think. Well, we'll get into why that is when we'll get into the path forward part, but I'll leave it at that for now. And yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much. I guess I just want to acknowledge that first off, I'm on the territory of the Wolastoq and the Micmac and the Passamaquoddy, since we're talking about colonial harms. And I think there's so many topics I want to talk about, and all the suggestions in the report are obviously connected intersectionally and work together. But since I have to be forced into a choice, which is hard for me, I chose Make It Grow, and I also chose Criminalizing People is No Solution. I'll start with Make It Grow. Out in New Brunswick, I know a lot of people are from different places here. We just had a political shift from conservative to liberal, but it goes back and forth a lot, and that affects the ability to make these things grow in a logical, objective, humanistic way. Politics here in New Brunswick sometimes involve a lot of religious tones. Money is donated to non-evidence-based religious recovery programs that get $1 million+ dollars, but other places, like the place I'm working at, a Riverstone Recovery Center, is a pilot project of 5 years, and we're looking for funding and things like that. So I think it's important for people to have faith-based recovery, of course, but I also think in New Brunswick it's important to have secular options too. We don't really have those as much. Harvest House gets them, other options get them. As somebody who just graduated with a counseling degree, I try to make sure that there's options for spirituality, options for organized religion, but also an awareness of the traumas that could have happened, or people's wanting to not follow religion and do what speaks to them. We don't have that in New Brunswick. We also don't have enough access to consumption sites, safe consumption sites. They don't really exist. Moncton has one safe injection site. There's not a lot of options for anyone other than a medical model. I think both should exist, obviously, different different offerings for people to meet them where they're at. It would be great. I think the medical model we have here is working really well, but I think there's also options for safe consumption sites, secular recovery places, community centers, and also community engagement centers with nurses, nurse practitioners, people with lived experience, and wraparound services like that. I think the two previous speakers made a lot of great points, like connected to what I'm talking about with Make It Grow, because I think if we're not going to focus on the root causes and we're not focused on relationships, we're not focused on humanism, and we're not focused on holistic offerings that give a menu to people that are trying to seek care, then we're not actually meeting people where they're at. We're not actually growing towards what we need to do. I've always introduced myself as an ace score kid who found purpose, and I wouldn't be at this table without harm reductionists that did different things, and even at times I won't say who, because they offered some modalities that would have actually probably put them into questioning by their bodies of authority, that they shouldn't do certain things like psilocybin treatments and things like that. But that saved my life. It spoke to me in a way. I tried all the other options. I think we need to make these options grow in a way that we listen first. So I guess what I'm trying to say in the long way around is that making it grow is connected to nothing without us. So you can't build it and you're not going to grow it in the right way. Like, who are we growing it for? And when Aretha was speaking, I thought, like, slogans at the organizational level, they need to meet people at the service level. Who are we making these slogans for? Is it actually what we're doing for folks? So if we're going to grow these things, it should be a lot of support workers who do have lived experience. Anecdotally, I don't want to make it about me, but I when I was doing my practicum, I tried to see if mental health and addictions here would be interested about me. They told me on the phone that they were only going to take people in practicum that are interested in hiring. That was the verbatim message. Interesting message. They told me that they do not take licensed counseling therapists, they do not take peers, they do not take harm reductionists if over 5 years experience. We're in a mental health crisis where we're trying to grow this, meet people at the front lines, get them into services. So why not scaffold these services and make them a little more approachable for people that have been stigmatized, have access issues, hold them, preserve life, like Dylan, I think that's your name. If I'm saying it wrong, I apologize. Preserve life. And when Dylan was talking about preserving life, I think that's obviously important, but I would love to see preserving life to living life with agency be a goal. I'm obviously got to keep people alive. Can't work with somebody who's not around. But yeah, and then the other one about criminalizing people is no solution. Again, around the government switches, we were started with a conversation about building a jail in Fredericton. It wasn't palatable to some people. We spent money on the start of that. Then there's a security company watching an empty parking lot where they were going to build it. Then they switched to Minto, New Brunswick, and then that's going through now. So I mean, I sit with people every day and they tell me there's nothing for me in the jail system that makes me feel like a human, that I can talk to a counselor that I feel safe with, or it doesn't exist as a program. I'm not trying to browbeat everyone or anything like that, but I think we need to make sure people aren't furtherly criminalized, furtherly stigmatized when they get into institutions. I felt like a criminal most of my life until I was allowed to have a certain medication. It was in my pocket. People didn't know. I was always running around doing certain things. But I mean, that relationship and me being criminalized was directly connected to things that happened to me as a young child. And that was my only way to seek safety and to soothe myself. And there wasn't options, I guess, right back to nothing without us for us, that spoke to me. My use of drugs, my punk culture, my queerness was all a problem. Abstinence was a goal. I don't know, man. Like that just shut me up. I took pills and I took other things on the side, and I learned I was the problem. So I left care, and long story short, just applying for a harm reduction job and running a needle exchange and being with people who looked like me, didn't look like me, but shared some common suffering is the reason. I don't know, still going. So I think I should have this disclaimer that I cry during these things, but yeah, I think this whole conversation that the other two speakers have had is just very connected to humanism and giving people offers that are past colonialism and past like a heteronormative white Anglo-Saxon kind of thing. I'm not against those folks either, but I just think we should see further than our own positions and involve all people. And I'll stop talking.
Thanks, everyone. I know it's gonna be pretty heavy stuff. question 2 might also go into pretty heavy stuff, but I promise question 3 is more optimistic. And I encourage people, our attendees, in the Q&A, if you want to ask them questions that are action oriented, that are looking towards the future, questions around working together, we encourage those kind of questions too. We would definitely want to try to, end the webinar on an optimistic note as much as possible, without falling into that kind of toxic positivity speech, of course. So sharing the backdrop of everyone's work, obviously the themes of the people mainly affected by this crisis is coming up a lot. And that being said, and we can kind of predict that it's not looking good right now. How have things been looking like in your communities, more specifically, since we've had those dialogues with Getting to Tomorrow over the last year? Aretha, I'll let you go first.
That's a big question. And I say that because, I am also a program supervisor at Salvation Army, the Booth Center. I seen it in one of our notes. Kayla, that worked with me, is here too. And the reason why I say that's a heart, because it shifted in more of a negative place, especially when it comes to the Black community. And I see that as working also as a program supervisor at Hamilton Booth. While I'm away, what I saw is more of deteriorating, right? Folks were deteriorating, the drugs that they were using, the overdose were getting higher, the point of saving someone's life in itself when it comes to bringing that information was just, it was just absolute for me. And I can also talk about going to the Jeff Policy Conference last year. One of the things that came up mostly was, so many individuals in this room, especially from Canada, when we went to Phoenix, Arizona, and none of us knew each other. Everyone there that was doing the work, and none of us knew each other. And that goes back to the first question of us working in silos. When it comes to all of this, we're hurting each other, right? And it's getting worse. Like, it's absolutely getting worse. It's not getting any better. And you have folks, when you see someone and they want to see a caseworker that looks like them, that can, support them in the way that they need to, and they don't even have that ability to do that. Right? So when we're talking about specifically a community, I'm going to always talk about the Black community. I'm going to always talk about the community that I serve that's suffering, because there's no safe site for them to go to. There's no one to speak to when it comes to harm reduction to safely support them in doing that. When you talk about the agencies that represents them, how are you representing them when you can't support them in the betterment of their growth? Case management going on, and you can't even allow me as a Black woman or a Black man to see someone like me to support my growth when it comes to the drugs use that I use. No, that's not happening. So our shift, it's not getting better. It's getting absolutely worse. And you have individuals that are working in this field like myself that gets worn out and overwhelmed because there's so much things that we want to change, but then there's a hierarchy above us where there's certain things that we really cannot do ourselves. And then when we speak up, we get in trouble for speaking up about these things. But change needs to happen, and it has to start somewhere. How do we do that if we're shunning folks and telling them that they can't come to the shelter? Oh, you can't do this. There absolutely has to be some resolution. There has to be some type of intervention, prevention method for us to deal with it. And it has to be in every cornerstone, in every single policy, program, agency that's saying they're supporting us when it comes to drug use, or when it comes to even just supporting us in getting a job, when it comes to supporting us when in safely being safe within ourselves, knowing what's out there. There's so much death. I dealt with a young man, and I was seeing him, and all you heard was, "Hi, miss. Oh yeah, I started back school. I'm starting to do well now, and I'm starting to do this." And next week, what I heard was he passed away. everyone was so hurt by this. And that's because the resources that needed to be implemented, when you talk about taking actions and then moving forward, when it talks about those case actions and it talks about those agency that Steve talks about, you know, the acceptance of who he is and what he's doing with his life and being a part of something, knowing that this is happening, but being whole within myself to move forward and be accepted as an individual because it's needed. How can I move forward? How can I get help? It's not there. So when we talk about, and I'm very passionate about these things, so sorry, because when we talk about the shift has not gone anywhere. We lack so much things, so much, and so much work needs to be done, right? You know, like I said, I work in the shelter and it's just so sad. There's no space in the shelter and there's no space in the shelter. You have them outside in the cold now that it's winter. They now have to go through all sorts of things, what that looks like. So there's now more death happening. And as much as we try to make this light, unfortunately, we can't, because it's a problem. It's a problem that we have to continuously speak about until something is being done. It's a problem that we have to always bring to the forefront. And my issue is, we talk about it, but yet again, we're not consulting and implementing and, you know, ensuring that there's a reduction of things happening to help folks move forward and to do the right thing. So when we see folks like Steve get emotional, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. And it's because there's no work being done. The shift is not in a positive light, it's in a negative light. And we need to find ways on how to move in the right direction and do the things, because no matter when we talk to the media, no matter when we talk to the government, it's like it's going through one ears and out the other. So what are we supposed to do when we're on the front line? What are we supposed to do when we're standing firm and trying to speak up on things that's happening? And again, it goes back to the conference that happening in Arizona last year that I attended, and I also had to speak on. One of the biggest issue was, how are we not working together? Whether we're from North America or not, how are we not working together to find a solution for things to start happening? Even so, there's no one where there's a collective in Canada right now that is working with me when it comes to these things, right? So yeah, I can't say too much more than that, but I'm gonna leave it as that.
So I just wanted, before I get into the second question, I just wanted to jump back to something that Steve said about the whole, around the whole preserving of life. And I think, I mean, I think preserving life is the very baseline. And I think what I really want to, what I really mean when I say that is we need to value life again. And I think that's something that I've seen the real shift, and we see that in, you know, what we're seeing in Palestine and the attitudes around that, and what we're seeing to the ignorance of all the drug deaths here in BC and throughout Canada, is this devaluing of life, and this idea that some people are disposable or somehow not, their lives are not as valuable as others, are not worthy of being saved. And it's so I think part of the work is, in valuing their life, is celebrating the lives of the people that we work with and serve, and honoring those lives and validating those lives, because they are just as valuable and just as worthy and just as important as any other life on this planet. So I think that's a really key part of the work. And you know, yeah, it's about giving people options, giving people autonomy, giving people power over their lives, so that they can build the lives that they want for themselves and they deserve, because they do deserve to have the life that they want. And I think, you know, there's so many people have such limited options right now, and I think that's been the real shift that we've seen in BC is people have had fewer and fewer options. And I think, I mean, I'm trying to, the positive, I was trying to think about this earlier, about the whole idea of, I felt like the sort of the scope of what's possible seems to have shrunk, but I don't know that it actually has. I think it's just the timeline for it has been pushed back, and it's been slowed down, and it's incredibly frustrating to have that timeline slowed down, because people die in the meantime. And I think, but you know, I think this report it echoes previous reports. It echoes, the BC coroner put out a fantastic document that laid out exactly what needed to be done. And she repeated that. She put out follow-up reports that were all dismissed by the government. And I think that's been a really disappointing and kind of shocking shift that I think has happened. Is there was such momentum here in BC around harm reduction and particularly around safe supply, and sort of pushing towards opening the door to non-medical models of safe supply, and that door has been firmly shut since the Getting to Tomorrow consultation. Oh God, I just sort of blanked on my thought there. Yeah, that door has been shut, and it needs to be reopened. I mean, we know that the toxic drug supply, it's the drugs, it's the poison drugs that are killing people. I don't know why it's such a hard concept for people to understand. When you have something that's poisoned, you take away the poison to stop killing people. When there's tainted meat on the shelf, you have a recall. You get rid of the bad meat and you put new meat out there. It's not a really, it's just not that complicated a concept, and yet it's just people have a really hard time grasping it. And that sort of brings me to the other shift is that we've seen a real devaluing of facts and a real devaluing of the truth. And I think that's been we're getting our ass kicked on that one, is that we have, there's a huge machine creating the disinformation and spinning a narrative around decriminalization here in BC, around safe supply, around harm reduction generally. And we're now in a position where we have to sort of redeem safe supply in the harm reduction in the eyes of the public, because it's been so debased by this sort of disinformation, and there's so much bad information going on there. And it always has been an uphill battle for us, because our side is sort of, arguments require nuance, and they're counterintuitive, and their arguments, they can sort of fall back on 80 years of drug war propaganda and a lot of emotional arguments and a lot of fear-based fear-mongering. And so it's a tough battle, and I think that's going to be one of the key pieces looking forward, is how do we combat that disinformation, and what's the story that we're going to tell? What's the narrative that we're going to tell that's going to trump that narrative? But we'll get into that in the next question. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Cool. I always want to touch on what the two previous people said, because I really enjoy the commentary that's going back and forth, and it all seems connected to me. Aretha just pointed it out. Longevity thinking's new to me. Just called me right out. It was great. But and to the points Dylan made, I think like humanism works. When you devalue people, it's easier to wage a war against yourself. It's easier to label yourself an F up or something like that, and just roll with that self-fulfilling prophecy. There's an all-black punk band named Bad Brains. The song's I Against I, and I just want to read some of the lyrics. It's in the quest for the test to fulfill an achievement, everybody's only going to pursue themselves, when the fact of the matter is they just don't care to extend a helping hand to anyone else. So I think we really need to look past who we've been helping traditionally, and then look at who we've been leaving behind, and then not just look at who we're leaving behind, make policies, make slogans, make Facebook posts, but actually involve hiring these people, giving them consistent employment, giving them positions of power, not tokenizing, taking, and saying, okay, bye, you're done, your job's done. The job's not getting done. It's like education is, I don't know who said it, I wish I could quote people better, but education's a process you don't finish. Constantly needs to be reformed. Needs empathy involved. I used to be a teacher before the wheels fell off the cart. I hated myself, so that was why the wheels fell off the cart. But I always made the room safe. It's probably for my drama, but safe and fun first. And when I did that, everything else fell with it, as long as I had the right policies and the right education, the right materials, and everyone was treated like a human. Past what I might have labeled them with, I had to check my biases every day. I think we, as healthcare professionals and things like that, we need to check that. But also a lot of people who've been traumatized and have ACE scores are used to walking on eggshells. So they know what it feels like to constantly be checking for threats, constantly be seeing if they're welcome into the room, constantly feeling like an outsider. And populations that I didn't look like, I didn't grow up with, that had different religions, that had lack of religion, that had different culture aspects, are always the people I felt safer with. none of them demonized me. You know, they called me in, I learned stuff, I listened. Elder Chris Brooks and a couple dudes took me to a sweat once. I'll never forget that. Massive dude. This one guy was teasing me a little bit. Came out, and this massive indigenous dude said, "Were you making fun of my friend?" and pulled me next to him. Like, for a dude with daddy issues, that's pretty cool. Felt pretty safe. So I'm still humanizing myself through this, but since harm reductionists and people saw me, like, I'm sitting in front of the table, seeing the same things from other people, seeing where the stops come, seeing where the impasse to loving themselves was formed, and where the hate has been built, and where then the hate turns into harm. And I just think people are safer in community when they, like, I realized this recently. I told my boss, like, I don't want to die. I like myself and I have skills. That's like new to me, right? So a lot of people are teasing that thing back and forth, and I don't think we've actually built spaces that they can do discovery. I think discovery is a huge part of getting well, and well looks different for many people. And you know, I tried seeking safety is a great model that I've been offering as a group therapy recently. It's got some lived experience people in it. I can't say too much, but I had one person who comes telling me at first that they were scared to come, and then about 4 weeks later, they saw us on the street. They pulled over with their teenage daughter, and not many people want to, you know, have big conversations with teenage daughter, but like, that's my counselors, you know what I mean? So they feel connected to community. I think connection is a big part of it, but the general question was, how have things shifted? And I'll try to be quick with this, but there's a major increase in fentanyl use here in New Brunswick. We've increased the use of bylaw officers, and people have been reporting to me that they're just being moved along all day and night. They're being given tickets for jaywalking, things like that. These are people that are already sleeping rough, can't pay these tickets, and it's just punishment, right? It's just punishment on top of punishment. And like, how's that help for access? How's that help for humanizing person? How's that help you, you know, make some goals if you're constantly running, you're constantly paying a ticket, you're constantly being surveyed? There's an increase in accidental poisonings. They've already doubled here in New Brunswick since last year, and that's just in the first months of reporting. So that's pretty terrifying. I can be, you know, working here in a peer capacity counseling, and then all of a sudden I hear naloxone because somebody feels safe here, and there's an accidental poisoning. We just run it from the center. There's a lot more, I call it trank dope, if that's okay, but a lot more xylazine out there. There's also benzos and fentanyl mixed into the presses and powders. We have increased wait times and an increased need for mental health services. We've had a recent government change from PC to Liberal. Funding, I think some folks already talked about a bit, but there's many supportive programs, including like Riverstone and Sunar, but they're either at the end of their funding cycle where they haven't been given SUOP grants. And then I see that there's kind of an issue where we also need to de-silo our care, you know, see what, you know, what each agency does, make sure we communicate and collaboratively work on things, but that we're also not forced by government to fight for the same funding pots, and therefore we can't work together so well. Community online and in public appears more to be involved in NIMBYism, and even what's the word, like the pitchforks and the torches when they come after you, that thing. That's happening because, like, and there's a lot of like miseducation and increased stigma and threats towards people who use drugs and the people who help that community. I found myself on this like Facebook page in PEI saying that I go around in a van and I give out drugs to people. I don't even go to PEI, and that didn't happen. But I've also seen in those same dialogues, you know, when people get together and band together, they feel safer saying certain things. And I'm surprised every day how far it can go, but they're talking about, you know, meeting the harm reduction van and choking out the workers and things like that. So, you know, there's some real fears for having lived experience, for helping people, for sharing your story. You can be, you know, people can call CPS, people can call these places over historical stories you share. So like, I want to believe in safe spaces, but I think we just need to work on making safer spaces. And I don't know if a safe space can exist. I think we need to do a much more authentic job, including lived experience and not hurting the people that do help. And yeah, there's talks of forced treatment. I got to talk on CBC with a client about that. That was a mood that people were still for, and we don't even have enough beds or services available. So I don't know how forced treatment works in that regard. I'm real happy sunshine today, but no, talk about the real stuff and try to do real things here.
Thanks, everyone. Bita, would you like to share some of the work that you've been doing in the last year?
For sure. Yeah, big thank you to all of you for sharing Yeah, there's so much happening, and I'm glad we have this time to come together and talk about it. So I'm based in Toronto. The Ford government introduced a bill that just passed third reading on Monday. It's an omnibus bill, and one schedule of that bill limits what the province can do with respect to drug policy. And, classic tactics of putting it in an omnibus bill with another schedule that talks about name changes for people with like crimes of sexual assault convictions. So they've like kind of meshed it all together and are like communicating about it as a whole piece. So it's an omnibus bill, passed third reading on Monday. There's a Conservative majority in Ontario, so they just ran the thing through, bypass committee study, limit debate from 6 hours to 1. They're really just using their force to push this through. And this is despite, hundreds of thousands of people, like bodies that represent hundreds of thousands of people saying, we don't agree with this, we don't want this, we are concerned, we're wondering where the evidence is. The Auditor General just released a report yesterday that indicated that there's no indication of the evidence that was used to make this policy change. So I'll quickly describe what is actually in there. So it's Schedule 4 called the Community Care and Recovery Act. And so it introduces a 200-meter requirement. So any supervised consumption site must be more than 200 meters from any kind of childcare center or school and other, potential designated premises, which we don't know. So that means that any site that's already been established, up and running, that is within 200 meters of a school or childcare center has to shut down with no possibility for relocation. We know how difficult that is in a dense urban center or anywhere where there's a sort of a collection of different kinds of services in a specific geographic area. It becomes very difficult to then be 200 meters away from an ideal space. And let's remember that these services were established in areas of high need. So the services popped up to meet the need of that community. And so now they're being pushed out of those communities with this 200-meter rule. It prohibits the any municipality or Board of Health from applying for a federal exemption for decriminalization of personal possession. So Toronto did make an application. Ultimately, that was not approved by the federal government. However, this bill, which will become law soon as it receives royal assent, would prohibit any municipality or Board of Health from requesting decriminalization. It also it limits the ability of municipalities and boards of health to make applications for federal exemptions for supervised consumption services. So even if you're outside of the 200-meter rule, and if you're a municipality or board of health that wants to renew an exemption, that then now has to go through the provincial minister of health. So the province is really seeking to put up roadblocks. They've said at their media appearances that they are not going to establish any more of these sites in the province. So it's quite the thing. It was rammed through in a very short amount of time to a lot of, despite significant community outcry, despite significant opposition amongst other MPPs. And our conversation today also broadly, and I'm thinking about this a lot, is how so much of our work is mapped in these election cycles. So thinking about, I'm finding it personally helpful amongst these like really hard times to zoom right out. We're a part of this cycle. It's a long, many years long cycle. And things like this is the result of those longer political cycles and shifts towards more regressive policy, not only when it comes to drug policy, but environmental policy, other kinds of like housing development, higher density housing development has been an issue for us here in Ontario, et cetera. So, yeah, that's what's been happening in Ontario lately. We've been pushing back. So I think some of you are probably on the call, part of a provincial network, supporting one another through these changes, and that's been immensely helpful. I think going back to what Aretha and others were naming around silos, it becomes very difficult to navigate these large political shifts if you're doing it on your own and if you're not being resourced to do so. So many, so many people in this fight are doing it when they can, as they can. And it's just so important to share resources, ensure we're not duplicating work. I think that that's been really important, as well as figuring out how to talk about the issues. I think there are certain voices and bodies out there that, like groups, that would like to think that this is an issue of drugs in and of itself or the people who use them, when it's really about so much more. It's about respecting human life and other forms of life. It's about those kind of original, I almost want to call them like original lessons, or, that we need to come back to and like remember what this is actually all about and communicate that effectively. And then from a less, maybe looking at our public health structures and our governments and these people we've, collectively, I'd say, elected to represent us and run our institutions and systems, they're not going to work well in this kind of environment. So what are the impacts to healthcare broadly? What are the impacts to even like housing for everyone, meeting everybody's basic needs, which these governments are obligated to do so. These rights are protected. And so even though we have these governments kind of throwing their weight around, forcing this stuff, taking advantage of these political moments to push their agendas, I think it's important to communicate effectively about what we're actually talking about here when we talk about drug policy or anything else. And also just keep in mind that it's part of a large cycle and it will come back around again. And we'll keep pushing, we'll keep fighting.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I feel like right now, in this moment, our human capacity is kind of we're kind of seeing its limit more so when it comes to like how many times we can get back up from all this oppression and trauma here and elsewhere, when I really think it should be exploited more towards the work and the things and the people that we love. And I think that is like really a wall that we're hitting across communities. Um and I think it's kind of like when it comes to what you just said, Bita, we got to get more creative onto how to get our message across so that people feel concerned and they don't feel like it doesn't concern them, because this issue of humanity, of health, of housing, um you know of kinship, of being connected, of being in community, um I think it's what's at the core of our work. And so for our last question, I want to ask everyone, what is the path forward for us working together in the upcoming year across differences, whether those be, provinces, urban, rural, different communities, different struggles, given that we share this same struggle towards community, towards health, towards housing. Aretha. Oh, I think you're muted.
There you go. I think for me, that's always a hard question when it comes to anything that I've done within the community, because with that question, you have to think about the government, you have to think about community, you have to think about, folks on the front lines, so the workers in itself, you have to think about so many individuals. And, the path forward, I believe, is the continuous work that we do. I see so many amazing folks that's, a part of this webinar. And that just shows me there's hope, right? There's hope. So when we talk about humanity, I always say that there's hope. So we need to give ourselves grace when it comes to moving forward and knowing that there is a way forward. It's just about finding what that way forward looks like, and what we can do when it comes to, allowing everyone to use in a healthy standpoint. Again, when we talk about the Black community, allowing them to be educated on what safe sites are available to them, allow them to be educated on what harm reduction means, and to put them in the educational standpoint. What I find is that educating folks is always better. In my field, there's a lot of that missing. And I say that because there's really a lot of that missing. And that's the only way we can move forward. I've been in rooms where I have to, like, people are absolutely, what's the word I'm looking for? They just don't know, or they're just absolutely ignorant. Right? And I look at it to say whether they don't know or they're ignorant, and sometimes it can get overwhelming, education is the key. And that's me standing in the room to educate folks on the Black community, what's missing in the Black community, what's needed in that Black community, the system discrimination that we're having when it comes to us as folks, whether male, female, and what we go through, the impact that's having on our community, the liminal impact that's happening, right? The lack thereof that's happening within the community, and what our needs are. So when I look at moving forward, it is going to take time, but I have hope that there is a way forward, that there is a way for all of us, whether that's provincial, whether that's, rural, different identity groups in all capacity, we can all work together and do great things. And also, when I talk about educating, I'm also talking about educating the government, because a lot of the things that's happening on the front line, the government has no idea. So they're making policies and making rules and making all these things when they really haven't lived it. And most of all, they haven't even spoke to someone who's actually been living it. When we talk about housing, when we talk about, drug use, when we talk about coming together and working together as one, preserving life, right? When we talk about the right to know, a lot of the government officials have no idea. And then when I come knocking at their doors, they don't want to open. So I'm at a point in my life right now where I'm telling you, if you're not opening, I'm jumping through the window. And if I'm jumping through the window and you also close the window, I'm also going to create a table where now you are able to come to this table for us to actually make these decisions that's necessary to be made, because that's the only way of moving forward. If you're not listening to folks like myself, who's on the front line, dealing with individuals that's going through all of these things, and you're not ready to take heed, then there's something wrong. But there is a way forward, but you have to be able to meet us halfway. And that's meeting us halfway where we can actually, and we're speaking to those who is trying to meet us halfway, because a lot of people don't have trust. And if folks have trust in me to bring it to the forefront, to government officials, to other community members, to other, folks that does not look like me, to understand what it is to be me in this society and to support me when it comes to this magnitude, that is how we move forward. Until we do that, we're not going to, but I have hope that we can and we will.
So in terms of the path forward, I think I started looking at the big picture. I see solidarity is such a key piece of this. I think, and we talked a few times about silos in this conversation, and I think the solidarity piece of reaching out to groups that are maybe not our traditional allies, and are a little more that sort of a bigger tent approach to and in doing that, connecting our issues. So that, you know, we talked about intersectionality as well. This is not just about drugs. This is not about drug users. This is about poverty. This is about valuing human life. This is about housing. This is about food security. This is about decolonization. This is about racial oppression. This is about the history of the way we've treated Indigenous peoples in this country. There's so many intersecting issues that are working again, you know, working just compounding the harms throughout society. And I think so. Finding our allies and finding where those areas of commonality and how we can lift each other up. And I think really looking at this all through a human rights lens is really important as well, because this is what we're fighting for, is people's basic human rights, the rights to live with dignity, to live with autonomy, to have agency, to have options. And I think in that human rights lens, we can also look at that as a strategic sort of guide as well, because I think one of the paths forward, I think, is the path through the courthouse. I think we need to be going to court to fight for our rights, because that is what it's going to take. Governments have learned over the past year that there's no political consequences to letting drug users die. And that is a stark, grim reality that we think we have to face and not accept. And not accepting that and rejecting that is taking them to court to force them to honor people's rights to you know, here in BC, we have the Bill 34 was the public drug consumption law. It was a very oppressive law. It gave police ridiculously expanded powers where if they thought someone had recently used drugs, then they could be detained, essentially, is what that law would have allowed. And so the Harm Reduction Nurses Association got an injunction, and that case will eventually get to the Supreme Court. It's now been bumped back to the summer. But the BC government then went and sort of did this end run and basically got everything they would have had in that bill. They basically did through recriminalizing. They did amendments to the decriminalization exemption and basically recriminalized drugs. And not only did they recriminalize, but they actually basically introduced new offenses, because they've now got it on the books that it's illegal to consume drugs, and that was never actually a law before. It was only possession, but that's getting into the weeds a bit of that stuff. But it's so they basically the BC government was told by a judge that the bill they were going to pass was going to do irreparable harm, that would kill people, and they disregarded that and did an end run around and managed to do what they wanted to do through the decrim exemption. And so that case is going to court. There's a judicial review that has been launched by the BC coalition of groups for and by drug users. And I think that that's sort of the path that we need to go forward. I think we really need to be fighting those battles in court, because that's where we can assert our charter rights. And that's where we can, you know, again, in terms of that, valuing the humanity of all of us and of drug users is, you know, taking them to court, because that's, you know, those rights are worth fighting for. Those lives are worth fighting for. And so I think that's a really important piece as well. And one last bit, in terms of the solidarity piece as well, I think looking internationally and building some coalition, some bridges internationally. I think if you're looking at what's happening in Central and South America and the conversations they're having there, the conversations they're having in Europe, they're all moving towards regulation, towards human rights-based drug policy, towards harm reduction, and that is the trend that's going on, and we're sort of heading in the opposite direction here in North America. So I think that building those alliances and watching what's happening in those countries and sort of building on that and that momentum and energy is really important as well. Thank you.
That was some riveting stuff from both of you. I agree with both of you. The human rights lens is where we need to go with how we treat people, and also how we need to have something in the chamber to send towards government. If we're going to get real, we can hold them accountable to human rights and treating certain groups different than other people. And also based on what Aretha mentioned, I came up with this like little plan for how things would work and be perfect. So I got a 2-page report here. I'll try to be quick. But I do see problems that Aretha brought up. That, like, you know, governments change. Will agencies align? Do we even have time to, in this crisis, to meet up enough? I mean, we need to make time, but how much time? Like, I've had people knocking on my door during this presentation. I've told people not to. It's beautiful to have people want to come talk to you. That people that they feel safe enough that they come in and they fall asleep on your desk because they have no other safer space, and they've chosen, to be the most vulnerable around you because they trust you and the relationships there. But time is a real hard thing for the front lines, and burnout is real too, and people change in positions because of it. There's also like the freedom to speak without punishment for lived experience people, to bring up ideas, to change things with integrity and not have to worry about, this is what will work, this is what the clients are saying, but being worried about saying it and to have something happen is a real fear for lived experience people. Job security, things like that. But the human rights approach and using the law, I think, is really great. Use what's already built to break down the system. But I'll be really quick. I'll try to. So some of the stuff is New Brunswick connected, and some of it might be existing a little bit, but maybe not doing what it needs to yet. So I think we need to establish an interprovincial task force to collaboratively have representatives from health ministries, from nonprofits, from healthcare providers, experts in harm reduction, and like meet quarterly, talk about the challenges, put everything together, see where the pieces are. We're starting to do that a little bit, but we don't meet enough. I think I'm one of the few people who've lived experience, if not the only one, that is open about it there. So some structure changes could happen to that. I think we need standardized guidelines for harm reduction across the nation. I think that's something that this group could work on and disseminate across provinces. So we all have something we're working with together. Not forced to a script, but at least the same ideals, because we don't have time and we need to be on the same mission and same kind of collective thing for other people. Regional resource sharing, if you've learned something that helped you in Alberta, that helped you get through a government issue and keep a recovery center open, please share it with the other provinces so we can try to something similar. Data sharing, collaboration. I know confidentiality can be a issue there, but also like cross-border referral systems. So if a client is leaving care in one area, that we can know about other harm reduction services and have some kind of relationship, and as long as confidentiality is there and ROIs are signed and things, we might be able to ease access for a person who's already struggling with a lot of things. On the other side of rural access, I've been wanting a mobile harm reduction unit with an exam bed and myself and an NP just to be flying through the area. I used to run a kind of harm reduction supplies van in the past, and after I built some relationships, I was being involved, welcomed into houses that most people wouldn't be welcomed into. We were even talking. I was talking with dealers who were changing their mix to have less accidental poisonings after a good chat. They're carrying naloxone. They start carrying test strips. Like, this is all at the relationship level, because I was vetted after like 5 trips up there. I started getting invited to some new places. If you could level that up and have an NP in there to do like diagnosing, prescribing, like similar to what they do in Halifax with the Mosh van, maybe a prescription of methadone or whatever to cut the crust off, kind of thing, to help somebody through the day, if that could happen, things like that. When people are met, humanized, they're going to access care more, and that goes down the line to where they might go to other services and have their wounds looked at or something else because they were brought into care and seen. I think telehealth expansions, rural outreach teams would be great, and rural outreach teams, I have nothing against certain organizations, but I think if you're going to have a rural outreach team, involve somebody from that community, involve somebody that's already has some lived experience, involve somebody that knows that place, so you're not spending too much time going places where there's no one, or offering services that they don't want. I think that needs to be done. Incentivize rural healthcare providers and give more power to nurse practitioners. They do so much. And the last little bits are, I would say, like, to make sure vulnerable groups are not missed, like culturally tailor your services to folks, but don't just make it a slogan, don't make it a window dressing. Constantly revisit the communities that you're wanting to learn better about in a listening fashion, in a relationship building, and go back, and don't just do it in a research manner and getting information and leaving. Come back to the community and listen and offer something. Outreach more to people with co-occurring disorders. I think that's missed a lot. Youth and gender sensitive programs. Get into the schools more with not a DARE program, but lived experience, and something that listens to people and offers something different. Not against DARE completely, but like, I wore the DARE shirt as not the way it's supposed to be worn. My mom took it from me, but that's another story. Address housing instability. I think that's huge. Addressing that in a way that also is built with people who have lived experience, who know that there's a lot of push and pull when you get into a place. You feel like, you know, you got the guilt of being inside. You want to help your friends. The quiet comes, and you're like, what the hell do I do? There's a lot of preparation and a lot of wraparound supports that need to happen in housing. And yeah, just peer support and community-based models, I think, would help. And as groups like us meeting to constantly work and collaborate on policy development and talk about stigma and kind of look at sustainability and how we can do this. But I think the biggest thing would be collaborative work in a humanistic framework to create collaboration across the country, because we're fighting a lot of different groups at once, and we're fighting miseducation, we're fighting stigma. So we have to have a concentrated and collaborative message for this, and constantly work together. It can't just be here and there. When they bring me into the federal government or provincial government for these equitability conversations, I know I did this, but like I challenged them openly, said like, okay, we're talking about equitability. I'm brought into this room once a year, and we talk about lived experience, and I go away for a year, and then we talk about what changed. It's not even equitable at the table. There's only me with lived experience that you've brought in. We're not revisiting this over and over, and we're talking about the maritime or the Atlantic provinces as one region. That, in my mind, is the approach isn't even equitable. It's not set up to be equitable in the first place. There's different regions with different needs. There's different power structures. There's not enough people with experience in the room. The positions, I get to say stuff, but I don't get any choice in the changes that happen. So I think equitability needs to include empathy and evidence too. That's the end of my soapbox rant.
Thank you, Steve, Dylan, and Aretha. I hate being a facilitator sometimes because I kind of have to be like the asshole that has to like keep a time check when people are being like brilliant and vulnerable. We don't have a lot of time left. I hope we can get through one question in the Q&A. I want to give the mic to Shane also. If there's anything, I'm going to copy paste the question in a document, and we'll try to kind of send out like an email to everyone who's attending so that your question can still be answered. But before we do that, Shane, would you like to jump in quickly?
No, not really. I don't know. I mean, I'm a long-winded fella and always happy to go on, but we don't have much time left. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and folks will always get a chance to hear me rant some other time. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you'll be able to catch Shane another time. I will just ask the question that is the most upvoted. We have a question here from Carla, which is, I do not disagree with continuing to put pressure on our governments with evidence to support harm reduction, but it seems clear that evidence is not the driving force, as there is plenty out there to support harm reduction, yet it is still being disimplemented. This leads me to try to think of how else we can advocate. Maybe we should focus on how the public, as they are the voters of these governments that push forward these stigmatizing policies. Any thoughts on this question to wrap up the panel? I'll let our panelists, whoever wants to go ahead, just unmute and you can answer Carla's question.
I don't know if I have an easy answer. I just want to agree that somebody said it can be both. That's cool. I was going to say about that, but also, politicians, choose my words carefully. No, they pander to the people who are going to vote to them, right? So there's a lot of power in talking to the voters. We've seen a lot of populist politics come in. There's the economy is not doing well. So when the economy is not doing well, it's easier to get the pitchforks and the torches out and just focus on somebody else and blame it on them. You don't have to convince people that there's bad people. You just have to convince that they want to take something from you or they cost you extra or something like that. We've walked away from prevention. I think prevention and human rights are two things we need to talk about, and also levy that it's not just people who use illegal drugs that are causing harms in the community. They're costing you money. There's so many other sites that do, the bars and the weekend. I'm not trying to demonize alcohol, but the CCSA, talks about the tobacco and alcohol causing the most harms and the most hospital costs and things like that. I think we need to have more community dialogues like we're having now, but in local communities with a standardized message about, how harm reduction works. Have conversations. I think Aretha talked about like bringing people to the table. Like I've changed a lot of the biases in myself and a lot of my emotional regulation through therapy. Doesn't mean I'm going to agree with something that's harmful, but I can at least sit in the room with somebody, let them speak, let them have their information, and then use their own words to kind of challenge the things that they're saying empathetically, objectively, and make correlations and connections to, like, well, aren't bars safe consumption sites? I mean, I can get what I want. There's a label. I know where it came from. I know it's 5%. I know, after a work day, that distresses me. I mean, it doesn't work for me necessarily. Other things work for me, but I don't have that same option as you. I don't have the same supports. I don't have a bartender that's going to check if I consume too much or call me a drive home. So like, I guess levying like education, empathy, and then connecting that certain services don't exist for certain groups and certain things have happened to certain groups. So these are reasonable responses and we need to help folks in a humanistic way. Having those conversations, I think, could be good. Attaching that lived experience people to public health workers and then going to communities and doing that could be a great way of doing it. They just recently did that with me in public health. I went to the Upper River Valley and through some parts into Brunswick and just went from legion to legion, and people were coming from tent sites to talk that were living rough, and then there was people who were concerned citizens who were upset with people existing in their community. There's police officers, but I just kind of like the Getting to Tomorrow talks. I just de-escalated things, stuck to humanistic values and evidence and lack of resources and the responses that happened because of it. I don't know if I answered that question, but that would be something I would think would could help.
Thanks, Steve. I think we have time for one final quick answer. Aretha or Dylan?
Yeah, I would just jump in and say I think I absolutely agree that facts don't matter. It seems we've got tons of evidence that's being ignored. So I think that's why, getting back to what I talked about, solidarity, I think that's really important in bringing people into our cause and finding those connections with other causes, because those networks sort of, we build those networks and they reverberate into their networks, and then sort of the message gets out that way. Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of it. The messaging is so difficult. We were so under-resourced in terms of like what we can do with messaging. We don't have the money to buy, to get it would be great to get an advertising company to help us develop messaging and to get professionals who can build a campaign around the messaging and those common slogans but I don't know that we have the resources for that. And also the fact that just so many of us are stretched with doing frontline work as well as doing sort of policy work and strategic work off the side of our desks. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, everyone. This is all the time we had for today. This was our first webinar in a long time, so I appreciate everyone just joining and listening, and catch you next year. Take care.